Share the Sealed Cabin, 74 Years of Silence. Welcome to this unique literary journey. Today I will take you to an era where secrets were kept in dusty chests and justice walked slowly along dirt roads. A story that teaches us that truth, no matter how buried, always finds its way to the light. Have you ever imagined discovering that your family lost something valuable decades ago? Something that would completely change your life? This is the story of Francisco Santos, a simple man who discovers a secret capable of shaking the power structures of an entire era, a narrative about dignity, courage, and the transformative force of truth. Tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this story? Your presence here makes this journey even more special. If you appreciate narratives that touch the soul, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Each gesture of affection strengthens our community of good literature lovers. Year 1879. Interior of Minas Gerais, coffee region, era of the coffee barons. The afternoon sun painted golden the hills that embraced the village of São João do Cafezal, while Francisco Santos adjusted his tired hoe between his calloused hands. Sweat trickled down his dark forehead, mixing with the red earth that stuck to his skin like a second nature. At 38 years old, he knew every furrow of that land, every stone on the path that led to his modest adobe house at the back of the property. Maria das Dores was folding the last clothes of the day, her skillful fingers caressing the coarse cotton fabric while watching her son Chiquinho, 9 years old, playing with a wooden horse under the shade of an aroeira tree. The evening breeze brought the aroma of ripe coffee and the melancholic song of sabia birds, creating a melody that cradled the simple hearts of that family. The sound of hooves on the dirt road made Maria das Dores raise her eyes. An elegant man, mounted on a bay horse, was approaching the small property. He wore a dark coat and top hat, contrasting with the simplicity of the place. Francisco cleaned his hands on his cotton shirt and walked to meet the visitor, intrigued by such an unusual presence. "Francisco Santos?" asked the man, dismounting from his horse with ceremonious movements. "That's me, sir. Dr. Benedito Almeida, notary from Ouro Preto. I bring news about an inheritance that belongs to you." The words seemed to echo in the hot afternoon air, like stones thrown into a tranquil lake. Francisco felt his heart accelerate, while Maria das Dores approached silently, holding Chiquinho by the hand. An inheritance? How could a poor worker have any right to any inheritance? Dr. Benedito opened a leather folder and removed documents yellowed by time. "Your distant uncle, Ignacio Santos, died 3 months ago. He left in his will a property that had belonged to the family for many generations." Francisco swallowed hard. He could barely remember hearing about this uncle, a nebulous figure in conversations whispered by the family elders. "What kind of property, doctor?" "A cabin near the Gold Creek, 2 leagues from here. Small, but yours by right of blood." The notary extended a rudimentary map, pointing to a location surrounded by symbols that Francisco couldn't decipher. The land was in an area known only by the oldest in the region, a place shrouded in mysteries and whispers. "The cabin has been sealed for 74 years, continued Dr. Benedito, observing the expression of surprise on Francisco's face. "Your great-grandfather, Sebastião Santos, was the last to inhabit it. Since then, no one has dared to open it." Silence settled between them, heavy like the air before a storm. Maria das Dores squeezed her husband's hand, feeling the tension emanating from his body. 74 years of silence. What secrets could be kept in that forgotten cabin? The notary put away the documents and mounted his horse again. "The keys are at the registry office. When you want to claim your inheritance, just show up there." As the man moved away down the dusty road, Francisco remained motionless, looking at the horizon where the mountains met the orange evening sky. An inheritance. After a lifetime of hard work and privations, destiny offered him something he didn't understand. But why had the cabin been sealed for so long? And why had no one in the family mentioned its existence? 3 days passed before Francisco gathered courage to fetch the keys at the Ouro Preto registry office. The journey of an entire morning on muleback gave him time to imagine what he might find in that mysterious cabin. Maria das Dores had remained at home with Chiquinho, but her last words echoed in his mind. "Be careful, Francisco. Sometimes the past holds pains that are better left sleeping." The cabin stood in a clearing, hidden among centennial eucalyptus trees, near the creek that murmured ancestral songs. It was small, built of stone and wood darkened by time, with a single window protected by boards nailed decades ago. A thick iron chain kept the main door closed, and in the oxidized metal, Francisco could see traces of a padlock that time had corroded. The keys jingled in his trembling hands while he searched for the right lock. When he finally managed to open the chain, it fell to the ground with a metallic sound that seemed to awaken the sleeping spirits of the place. The wooden door resisted, groaning on its rusted hinges, before opening with a sigh that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. The interior was plunged in dense twilight, smelling of old wood and stopped time. Francisco lit the candle he had brought with him, and the flickering light revealed an environment preserved like a sanctuary. A rough wooden table occupied the center of the single room, upon it a hardwood chest with bronze details tarnished by time. With reverence, Francisco approached the chest. His hands touched the smooth wood, feeling the grooves left by artisanal tools from another century. The lock was simple, but when he tried to open it, he discovered it wasn't locked. The lid rose slowly, releasing an aroma of tanned leather and old paper. Inside the chest, carefully wrapped in deer hide, were yellow documents and a letter sealed with red wax. Beside them, a rosary of dark beads and a hand-carved wooden cross with an almost faded inscription, God's Justice. Francisco removed the letter with extreme care. The wax seal bore a symbol he didn't recognize, but his hands trembled as he broke the seal that had remained intact for more than 7 decades. The handwriting was laborious, but still legible. To whoever finds these words, I am Sebastião Santos, and I write in the year 1805, forced to abandon the lands that God granted me, and work transformed into paradise. The powerful men of this region used lies and violence to steal what belongs to us by right. I hide here the proofs of our property, hoping that one day a Santos will return to claim the justice that was denied to us. The lands from Gold Creek to the top of the mountain, 800 alcares of coffee and pasture, belong to our family since 1790. May God protect whoever fights for the truth. Francisco reread the words several times, his heart beating faster and faster. 800 alcares. That meant that his eyes turned to the other documents in the chest. Original land grants, purchase contracts, planting records. And then on a yellowed sheet he read the name that made his blood freeze. São João Farm. The farm where he had worked since childhood. The lands where he sweated every day to earn a few coins. The lands that belonged to Colonel Domingos Pereira. They were his family's lands. For 74 years, the Santos had worked as tenant farmers on a property that belonged to them by right. Entire generations lived in poverty, while others enriched themselves with the fruit of their ancestral patrimony. Francisco blew out the candle and left the cabin staggering, as if he had taken a punch to the stomach. The midday sun seemed different. The familiar landscape had gained new contours. Everything he knew about his life, about his family, about his place in the world, had just collapsed. The way back home seemed infinitely long. Francisco carried the documents wrapped in a piece of fabric that Maria had sewn years before, protecting them as if they were sacred relics. With each step, he felt the weight not only of the old paper, but of the truth he carried with him. Maria das Dores was sewing on the porch when she saw her husband approaching down the trail. She immediately noticed that something fundamental had changed in Francisco. His shoulders seemed to carry an invisible burden. His eyes had the brightness of someone who had seen beyond the veil of everyday reality. "What did you discover there, Francisco?" she asked in a low voice, putting away her needle and sitting beside him on the rough wooden bench. Without words, Francisco unrolled the documents and began to tell what he had found. Each word seemed difficult to pronounce, as if revealing secrets that the universe had conspired to keep hidden. When he finished speaking, silence fell upon them like a heavy cloak. Chiquinho played in the yard, oblivious to the drama unfolding between his parents. His laughter reached them like echoes of an innocence that might soon be lost forever. "That means," Maria das Dores began but couldn't finish the sentence. "It means we are owners of where we have worked for 3 generations. That my grandfather, my father and I myself have always been owners of the land where we serve as employees." Maria das Dores took her husband's hand, feeling the roughness of calluses formed by years of work on land that belonged to them. "And what do you intend to do?" Francisco looked at the horizon, where the mountains he had always contemplated as boundaries of a world too small now seemed like guardians of infinite possibilities. "I don't know yet, but I know I can't pretend I didn't discover this." That night, after Chiquinho fell asleep on his straw mat, Francisco and Maria remained awake in the darkness, listening to the song of crickets and the whisper of wind in the coffee leaves. Between them, the documents rested in an improvised drawer, radiating an energy that seemed to alter the very quality of the air. "Are you afraid?" asked Maria das Dores, breaking the silence that had extended for hours. Francisco took time to answer. "I'm afraid of doing nothing. I'm afraid that Chiquinho will grow up working as a tenant farmer on land that is his by right. I'm afraid this injustice will continue for another 70 years. Maria das Dores felt a tear roll down her face. "What if they hurt us? Men like Colonel Domingos don't usually accept challenges." "So be it. But I won't die knowing I was a coward when God showed me the truth." The first rooster crowed in the distance, announcing a new day. But for Francisco Santos, it was more than that. It was the dawn of a new life, a life where he would need to choose between the security of submission and the risk of justice. When the sun broke the horizon, painting the mountains of Minas Gerais gold, Francisco had made his decision. He would seek someone who could help him understand the legal value of the documents he had inherited. Whatever the cost, the Santos would recover their lost dignity. Francisco knew he needed advice, but wasn't sure whom to trust. In a society where Colonel Domingos Pereira was a powerful and respected figure, questioning his rights over the farm could be seen as madness, or worse yet, as insurgency. It was then that he remembered old Chico, a 76-year-old man who lived in a cabin even simpler than his own, by the creek. Chico had been a tenant of the family since he was a boy, and always demonstrated peculiar knowledge about the region's history. If anyone could know something about the Santoses' past, it would be him. Francisco found the old man sitting in the shade of a yellow ipe tree, smoking a clay pipe, and watching the creek waters flow lazily between the stones. His eyes, though clouded by age, still had the brightness of sharp intelligence. "Chico, I need to talk to you about my family." The old man gestured for Francisco to sit beside him on the smooth stone he used as a bench. "I imagine it has to do with that cabin you opened a few days ago." Francisco felt a chill. "You knew about the cabin?" Old Chico took a long puff from his pipe before answering. "Boy, I saw when your great-grandfather Sebastian sealed it for the last time. I was about 2 years old, but I still remember the sadness in that man's eyes." "Do you remember him?" "I remember, yes. Sebastian Santos was a tall man, strong as a bull, but with a heart soft as honey. He treated slaves well, paid fair wages to free workers. The farm prospered under his hands like a garden blessed by God." Francisco leaned closer. "And what happened?" Old Chico looked far away, as if he could see through the years. "Colonel Domingos arrived, still young at that time, but already full of ambition and without scruples. He brought papers saying the lands were his, bought from colonial authorities. Your great-grandfather showed the original land grants. But what good did it do? Who had money to buy a judge in those days? And my great-grandfather? What did he do? He resisted as much as he could. But when the threats began, when they burned down a tenant's ranch who supported him, when they poisoned the cattle, Sebastião understood he was fighting against forces greater than himself. On the last night before leaving, he called me and said, 'Chico, one day someone from the family will return. When that happens, you tell the truth.'" Francisco felt a knot in his throat. "And my grandfather, my father, did they know?" Old Chico sighed deeply. "Your father, José Santos, discovered the documents in 1855. He was about 25 years old, full of courage and indignation. He sought the priest of the time, went to a lawyer in Ouro Preto. And what happened? One night they poisoned his horses. Another night they burned down the ranch. The third time 3 armed men appeared with a message. 'Your children might be born orphans if you keep meddling in things that don't concern you.'" Francisco clenched his fists. "He gave up? He fled to a distant region, even changed his name. You were born far from here, only returned when you were 8 years old, after the colonel guaranteed he had forgotten about the matter. But José was never the same. He died young, his heart broken by injustice." The sun began to lean westward, tinting the sky with soft colors. Francisco remained silent, processing the weight of the heritage he carried. It wasn't just land and documents, but decades of humiliation, 3 generations of men who bowed before injustice. "Chico, do you think I should fight?" The old man looked into Francisco's eyes with an intensity that seemed to pierce his soul. "Boy, at 76 years old, I've learned there are only 2 things worth living for: truth and dignity. You have both on your side. What remains is to decide if you have the courage to honor them." Francisco spent the following night in prayer, kneeling before the small oratory that Maria das Dores had set up in a corner of the house. The image of Our Lady of Sorrows, his wife's patron saint, seemed to look at him with maternal understanding, as if she knew the torments that afflicted his heart. At dawn, his decision was made. He would first seek Father Antonio, vicar of the local chapel, a man known for his righteousness and wisdom. If the documents had legal value, he would know how to guide him on the next steps. Father Antonio was a middle-aged man, thin and tall, with penetrating eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances. He received Francisco in his modest residence adjacent to the chapel, where books competed for space with sacred objects on improvised shelves. "Francisco, I heard rumors that you discovered something important in your uncle's inheritance. Father, I need guidance. I don't know if what I discovered is truth or illusion." Francisco carefully unrolled the documents on the dark wooden table. The priest adjusted his glasses and examined each paper with the meticulousness of a scholar. His expression gradually changed, from initial curiosity to growing surprise, and finally to solemn gravity. "My son, these documents are authentic. The paper, the ink, the writing style, everything corresponds to the colonial period, and more importantly, I recognize the signature of the governor who granted the land grants. I've studied similar documents in diocesan archives." Francisco felt his heart race. "So it's true? The lands really belong to us?" "By God's law, certainly. By men's law, that's more complicated." The priest stood up and walked to the window overlooking the mountains. "Francisco, do you understand the magnitude of what you discovered? 800 alqueires of coffee lands are worth a fortune. There are more than 700 slaves working on a property that should be yours. What do you advise me, Father?" "I advise you to seek a competent lawyer. I know a young man in São Paulo, Dr. Antonio Machado, who specializes in land issues and is known for his honesty. He also sympathizes with the abolitionist cause." Francisco felt a spark of hope. "Do you think he would help me?" "I think he would be fascinated by a case like this. A black family fighting to recover their usurped lands. This aligns perfectly with the ideals he defends." Black family. Francisco had never thought much about this. He knew his ancestors included freed Africans, but in a region where miscegenation was common, he rarely reflected on racial issues. Now, he began to understand that his struggle would have dimensions that went beyond simple property recovery. "Father, if I take this forward, will there be consequences for my family?" The priest turned to him with a grave expression. "There will be, my son. Colonel Domingos is not a man who accepts challenges passively, but we also cannot forget that God hates injustice above all things. If you fight with righteousness, he will be on your side." Francisco stored the documents with redoubled care. "How can I contact this lawyer?" "I can write a letter of introduction. Dr. Machado has an office on Rosario Street in São Paulo. If you can get there, I'm sure he'll receive you." 2 days later, Francisco departed for São Paulo on a journey that would last an entire week. Maria das Dores hugged him goodbye with tears in her eyes, knowing that the man who returned would be different from the one who left. While the cart swayed along dusty roads, Francisco looked back one last time, seeing his house shrink until it became a point in the landscape. He didn't know if he would return as a landowner or as a fugitive, but he knew he could no longer live pretending to ignore the truth. Justice called him, and Francisco Santos had finally found the courage to answer. São Paulo of 1879 was a city in transformation, where colonial mansions shared space with more modern constructions, and the aroma of roasted coffee mixed with the smell of steam locomotives. Francisco walked through streets paved with irregular stones, feeling small before urban grandeur, but carrying with him the certainty that his cause was just. Dr. Antonio Machado's office was on the second floor of a well-preserved townhouse on Rosario Street. Francisco climbed the wooden staircase with the documents tightly pressed against his chest, praying silently that this man could help him. Dr. Machado was younger than Francisco expected, perhaps 35 years old, with dark hair and lively eyes that seemed to absorb every detail around him. He wore a simple but elegant jacket, and his desk was covered with papers and books on imperial legislation. "Francisco Santos, Father Antonio wrote about your case. Please, sit down." Francisco handed over the letter of recommendation and, with trembling hands, unrolled once more the documents that had changed his life. The lawyer examined each paper with professional attention, taking notes on a separate sheet. "Extraordinary," he murmured after a few minutes. "These documents predate most imperial legislation on lands. By law, they have total validity." So I can recover my property? Dr. Machado leaned back in his chair, fingers interlaced over the table. Legally, yes. Practically, that's a more complex question. Colonel Domingos Pereira is a powerful man with important political connections. He won't hand over 800 alqueires of land without fighting. I'm prepared to fight, Doctor. Francisco, do you understand that this goes beyond a dispute over property? You are a black man claiming lands from a white colonel at a time when slavery is still legal. This will become a symbol, a banner for both abolitionists and conservatives. Francisco felt the weight of these words. Do you think that's bad? On the contrary, I think it might be exactly what this country needs. Dr. Machado stood up and walked to a shelf full of books. Francisco, do you consider yourself a free man? Of course I do. But there are 750 slaves working on the lands that should be yours. How can you consider yourself truly free while others remain chained on what should be your property? Francisco had never thought this way. The revelation struck him like lightning, illuminating connections that had previously remained hidden. Are you saying my fight is also for their freedom? I'm saying that true freedom only exists when everyone is free. If we recover your lands, you'll have the power to liberate these people. Imagine the impact that would have on the entire region. That night, staying at a modest inn near the train station, Francisco couldn't sleep. The lawyer's words echoed in his mind, expanding his understanding of the meaning of his struggle. It wasn't just about recovering lost properties, but about transforming an unjust structure that kept hundreds of people in captivity. The next morning, he returned to Dr. Machado's office with renewed determination. Doctor, I'm ready to do whatever is necessary. Then let's begin. First, we need to gather more evidence and witnesses. Then, we'll file a claim action. And Francisco, yes sir, prepare yourself for a long and difficult fight. Colonel Domingos is not a man who accepts defeat easily. He'll try everything: bribery, intimidation, maybe even violence. Are you sure you're willing to face that? Francisco looked out the window, seeing the movement of the big city, but thinking of the small adobe house where Maria das Dores and Chiquinho waited for him. Doctor, my great-grandfather was forced to flee. My father lived in fear. I won't allow my son to grow up working as a tenant farmer on land that belongs to him by right. Dr. Machado smiled for the first time since they met. Then let's make history, Francisco Santos. Francisco returned from São Paulo with more than renewed hopes. He brought a carefully crafted action plan by Dr. Machado. The first step would be to gather local witnesses who could corroborate the Santos family history and the legitimacy of their rights to the land. Old Chico was the first person he sought, but he quickly discovered he wouldn't be the only one. News of his mysterious trip to São Paulo had spread through the community, and several people approached him with their own stories about Colonel Domingos's injustices. Mané da Rosa, a 50-year-old man who lost his lands when the colonel built a private railroad cutting through his property, offered to testify. Dona Conceição, widow of a freed slave who was killed by the colonel's gunman when he tried to buy a piece of land, also joined the group. Pedro do Armazém, a merchant who for years was forced to sell products exclusively to the farm at below-market prices, brought detailed records of forced transactions that proved the colonel's abuse of power. In 2 weeks, Francisco had gathered 12 witnesses from diverse origins: poor white men, freed blacks, even some indigenous people from the region who had been expelled from their traditional lands. What had begun as a personal dispute was transforming into a broader movement against oppression. It was then that the first retaliation arrived. Firmino, the farm administrator, appeared at the store where Francisco usually bought supplies and instructed the owner to cut credit for the Santos family. "Colonel's orders," he said simply, but his eyes carried an implicit threat. In the following days, overseers began spreading rumors that Francisco was a runaway Negro trying to pass as free. The conservative priest from the neighboring town preached one Sunday about the importance of obedience to the order established by God and the disturbance caused by those who don't know their place. Maria das Dores felt the tension growing like a storm slowly approaching. Neighbors who had previously been friendly now greeted her coldly when they didn't ignore her completely. Chiquinho came home from school one day with a swollen lip, saying some boys had called him troublemaker's son. "Francisco, maybe we should reconsider," suggested Maria one night while tending to her son's injury. "The price might be too high." Francisco took Chiquinho in his arms, looking at the innocent face of the boy who had inherited his dark eyes and Maria's quiet determination. "It's exactly because of him that I can't give up." If we retreat now, he'll grow up knowing his father was a coward when he had the chance to change our history. The following week, Dr. Machado arrived from São Paulo with 2 assistants and a carriage loaded with law books. He installed himself at the town's only inn, causing great commotion among residents who rarely saw such distinguished visitors. Francisco, as we expected, the colonel has already begun to move. He hired 2 lawyers from Rio de Janeiro specialized in land issues. I also learned he sent emissaries to provincial authorities. And now? Now we formalize our petition. I have here all the necessary documents to file a claim action. But Francisco, Dr. Machado paused, his face taking on a grave expression. I received disturbing information. There are rumors that the colonel is hiring armed men. You and your family need to be very careful. That same night, as if to confirm the lawyer's fears, 5 men on horseback surrounded Francisco's house. They didn't enter the property, but remained there for almost an hour in silence, their silhouettes outlined against the full moon like dark omens. Francisco stayed awake until dawn, an old hunting rifle beside his bed. Maria das Dores held his hand throughout the night, both knowing they had crossed an invisible line from which there was no return. The fight for the Santos had officially begun, and the forces aligning against them were more powerful than they had ever imagined. The first hearing was scheduled for an August morning in 1879 at the town's chamber house. Francisco woke before sunrise, dressed in his best Sunday clothes, and walked to the location accompanied by Maria das Dores, who insisted on being present, and Chiquinho, who observed everything with the intense curiosity of a child who senses the importance of the moment. The hall was fuller than in any recent election. On one side sat Francisco's supporters, Old Chico, Mané da Rosa, Dona Conceição, Pedro do Armazém, and others who had found in the Santos struggle an opportunity to confront decades of oppression. On the other side, in an impressive demonstration of power, Colonel Domingos Pereira occupied the front row, accompanied by his 2 lawyers from Rio de Janeiro, dressed in expensive coats that contrasted with the simplicity of the rural environment. Behind him sat regional farmers, important merchants, and even some public officials. The colonel was a 60-year-old man, tall and imposing, with carefully trimmed white mustaches and cold eyes that seemed to calculate the value of each person in the room. When his eyes met Francisco's, there was no greeting or recognition, just a cold assessment that made the air seem heavier. Dr. Machado presented the documents with watchmaker precision, explaining the legitimacy of the original land grants and the line of succession that led to Francisco. His voice echoed clearly through the hall, each word building a solid edifice of legal argumentation. The colonel's lawyers counterattacked with a different strategy. Instead of questioning the authenticity of the documents, they argued that the lands had been improved and developed through decades of investment and work, and that removing them from the colonel's hands would cause grave disturbance of economic and social order. It was then that Colonel Domingos asked to speak personally. Gentlemen, I have known this family for many years. They are good people, hard-working and honest. But consider this. We are talking about Negroes who want to become owners of 750 slaves. His voice carried a paternalistic tone that made Francisco shiver. Do we understand the implications of this? Is it prudent to entrust such responsibility to those who have neither experience nor education to manage a property of this magnitude? A murmur ran through the hall. Francisco felt blood rise to his head, but Dr. Machado discreetly held his arm, signaling him to wait for the right moment. Moreover, continued the colonel, I am willing to make a generous offer to avoid unnecessary conflicts. 50 contos de reis and a smaller property in Espírito Santo, where the Santos family can live dignifiedly without disturbing the established order here. 50 contos de reis was a fortune for someone like Francisco. It represented decades of work, a lifetime of security for his family. The silence in the hall was absolute while everyone awaited his response. Francisco stood up slowly. His legs trembled, but his voice came out firm and clear. Colonel Domingos, you speak of me being Negro as if that diminished my right to justice. My great-grandfather Sebastião Santos built a prosperous farm on these lands long before you were born. He treated slaves well and paid fair wages to free workers. I don't need your education or experience to know what is right. The colonel also stood up, his eyes flashing with indignation. You are forgetting your place, Negro. No amount of money in the world can transform a tenant into a landowner. My place, replied Francisco, is where God and the law determine it should be, not where your prejudice thinks I should stay. The verbal confrontation that followed revealed the racial and social tensions that fermented beneath the surface of late 19th century Brazilian society. Each word exchanged between the two men echoed larger questions about freedom, equality, and the nation's future. When the hearing ended, without an immediate decision, Francisco knew he had crossed a Rubicon. It was no longer just about lands or property. It was about dignity, about a black man's right to demand justice in a society that hadn't yet decided if it considered him completely human. That night, 5 armed men appeared again around Francisco's house, but this time they didn't limit themselves to watching. They left a message written on a wooden board driven into the nearest tree. November 15th won't save you. The explicit threat completely changed the nature of the conflict. Dr. Machado immediately sent telegrams to abolitionists in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, informing them about the case and requesting support. The response was surprising. Liberal newspapers from both cities expressed interest in covering the story, seeing in it a powerful symbol of the struggle for racial justice. Francisco discovered he wasn't fighting alone. A support network began to form, connecting his cause to larger movements agitating the country. Letters arrived from abolitionist groups, offering financial and legal support. A young journalist came from São Paulo specifically to document the case. Locally, polarization deepened. Families divided, religious congregations fragmented between those who supported the Santos cause and those who considered the struggle a threat to social order. Father Antonio preached about justice and human dignity, while his colleague from the neighboring town warned against disturbances of Christian harmony. The situation escalated when Mané da Rosa suffered an ambush on his way home. 5 armed men surrounded him on an isolated road, severely beating him with whips, a symbol deliberately chosen to evoke the terror of slavery. They left him semi-conscious with a message: this is what happens to those who support uppity Negroes. Francisco visited Mané the next day, finding him in his makeshift bed, his body marked by wounds that would take weeks to heal. But the man's eyes burned with indignation, not fear. Francisco, this only proves we're hitting where it hurts. A man without reason doesn't need a whip to argue. The violence had an effect contrary to what the perpetrators expected. Instead of intimidating Francisco's supporters, it motivated others to join the cause. Free workers, small merchants, and even some white men of modest social position began to see in the Santos struggle an opportunity to challenge a system that also kept them in subordinate positions. Dr. Machado took advantage of the moment to expand the legal strategy. Francisco, we're going to file an action not only for property reclamation, but also for moral and material damages suffered by the family over 74 years. Is that possible? It's innovative, but legally sound. You were deprived not only of property, but of the income it generated for decades. This includes the unpaid work of 3 generations of the family. The audacity of the new strategy shocked even Francisco's supporters. It was no longer about recovering lands, but about questioning the entire system of exploitation that had benefited the powerful at the expense of the marginalized. Colonel Domingos responded by increasing the offer to 100 contos de reis and a farm of 200 alqueires in the interior of Espírito Santo. It's my last proposal, he declared through emissaries. After this, I cannot guarantee the Santos family's safety. Francisco met with his supporters on a rainy September night. The small house was packed. Old Chico, supported by a cane but with bright eyes, Dona Conceição, wrapped in a black shawl but radiating determination, Pedro do Armazém, with his carefully organized records, Mané da Rosa, still limping but present. People, it's time to decide. 100 contos is enough money for all of us to live well far from here. But if we continue, there's no guarantee we'll come out of this fight alive. Old Chico was the first to speak, his voice weak but firm. Francisco, I saw your great-grandfather expelled from these lands. I saw your father flee in fear. If you retreat now, I'll die knowing I served no purpose in my long life. Dona Conceição nodded vigorously. My husband died dreaming of the day when men like us could walk with our heads held high. I won't dishonor his memory by accepting dirty money. One by one, each supporter reaffirmed their commitment to the struggle, until Francisco realized it was no longer about his individual decision. It was a collective movement for dignity and justice that had gained a life of its own. That night, while rain drummed on the straw roof, Francisco wrote a letter to Dr. Machado. Doctor, we refuse the offer. We'll go to the end, whatever the cost. Truth cannot be sold for any amount of money. The trial date was set for May 3rd, 1880, on a morning that dawned clear and fresh, as if nature itself wanted to witness the approaching historical moment. Francisco woke before sunrise, knelt before the family oratory, and made a silent prayer for a just result and protection for everyone involved. Maria das Dores had sewn a new shirt for Francisco, using fabric she had obtained through months of savings. She wanted her husband to be presentable on that crucial day. Chiquinho, now 10 years old and better understanding the importance of the moment, wore his Sunday clothes and declared he wanted to accompany his father. The chamber hall was packed like never before seen. More than 150 people crowded into the space designed for half that number. Journalists from São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro occupied an improvised table, their pencils ready to record every word of what was already being called the trial of the century by abolitionist periodicals. The judge designated for the case was Dr. Augusto Mendes, a 60-year-old magistrate known for his erudition and integrity. A convinced monarchist, but with liberal ideas, he had publicly spoken against slavery on several occasions, which gave hope to Francisco's side. Dr. Machado presented his final argument with impressive eloquence. He cited not only the laws of the empire, but the principles of universal justice that should govern any civilized society. He showed how the Santos family had been systematically deprived not only of property, but of dignity and opportunities for almost a century. The colonel's lawyers counterattacked with technical arguments, claiming that changes in territorial legislation over the decades had made the old documents obsolete. They also stated that the social order disturbance, resulting from a decision favorable to the Santos, would create dangerous precedents for the entire provincial land structure. It was then that something unexpected happened. Colonel Domingos Pereira asked to speak personally against the explicit advice of his lawyers. He rose slowly, a man already aged by years and the weight of responsibilities he carried. His face, normally haughty and confident, showed signs of an inner struggle that few had suspected. Your Honor, gentlemen present, I come here no longer as a party in this process, but as a man seeking peace for his soul. A murmur of surprise ran through the hall. The colonel's own lawyers looked at each other, confused by the direction the words were taking. For months I have reflected on this case. I have prayed, sought divine guidance, examined my conscience, and I must admit that Francisco Santos is right. The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the creaking of chairs or the whisper of low conversations broke the quiet of the moment. My father, may God forgive him, used dishonest means to acquire the lands I now administer. Bribery, intimidation, document falsification, all this weighed on our family for generations. And I, instead of correcting this injustice when I had the opportunity, perpetuated it out of pride and greed. Francisco felt his heart beating so hard it seemed to echo throughout the entire hall. Maria das Dores held his hand, both barely able to believe what they were hearing. Therefore, continued the colonel, I come to publicly recognize the rights of the Santos family over the lands I have improperly administered for decades. More than that, as a form of reparation for the harm caused, I declare free all 750 slaves working on the property. The hall exploded in a mixture of shouts of joy, emotional crying, and excited conversations. Journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks, trying to capture every detail of the historical moment. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly until he managed to restore order. Francisco remained seated, tears streaming down his face, unable to fully process the magnitude of what had just happened. He had not only recovered his ancestors' lands, but witnessed the liberation of hundreds of people who lived in captivity. Dr. Machado approached him, his own eyes moist with emotion. Francisco, you just made history. This is not just the end of your personal struggle, but the beginning of a new era for the entire region. When he finally managed to stand up, Francisco walked to where Colonel Domingos remained, surrounded by people trying to understand his surprising decision. Colonel, said Francisco, extending his hand, you are a man of courage to publicly acknowledge the truth. The colonel shook his hand firmly, looking him in the eyes. Francisco Santos, the true courageous one here is you. I hope you know how to honor the responsibility that now falls on your shoulders. 6 months after the historic trial, the lands that had been known as San Juan Farm had a new name and a new reality. Francisco decided to call it Freedom Farm, in homage not only to the recovery of his ancestral lands, but to the liberation of the 750 men and women who were now free to build their own destinies. The transition wasn't simple. Francisco quickly discovered that managing a property of that size was infinitely more complex than working on it. Fortunately, many of the former slaves chose to remain as salaried workers, bringing knowledge accumulated over decades about every aspect of the property. Dr. Machado brought specialists from São Paulo to help organize the new administrative structure. Instead of maintaining the previous centralized system, Francisco opted to create a cooperative where each family of workers received a plot of land to cultivate, in addition to participating in the profits of general production. The most revolutionary innovation was the creation of the region's first school open equally to black, white, and indigenous children. Maria das Dores, who had learned to read with Father Antonio during the months of struggle, became the first teacher, teaching not only letters and numbers, but values of dignity and equality. Chiquinho, now 10 years old, attended classes alongside children of former slaves and children from the surroundings, whose parents perceived the importance of education for the future. Francisco watched with pride as his son grew up in a reality completely different from what he himself had known. Colonel Domingos Pereira, faithful to his promise of reparation, also donated a substantial amount for the construction of a popular hospital in the region, in addition to financing the arrival of a young and idealistic doctor who accepted to work attending to the less fortunate for free. The social transformation was profound and rapid. Families who had lived in captivity for generations discovered the meaning of private property, paid work, education for their children. Some chose to migrate to other regions, taking with them their savings and the experience of freedom. Others chose to stay and help build a new society. Francisco established a popular bank where working families could obtain loans to buy land, equipment, or start small businesses. The concept was simple. Instead of concentrating wealth, distribute it so that everyone could prosper. The arrival of European immigrants, attracted by the unique experience of Freedom Farm, brought innovative agricultural techniques and production diversification. Italians taught grape cultivation methods. Germans introduced cheese production techniques, and everyone learned from each other in a rich and productive cultural mixture. The local church, under Father Antonio's leadership, became a center of community activities where people of all origins gathered to celebrate, learn, and make collective decisions about the region's future. Dona Conceição, the widow who had supported Francisco from the beginning, established a seamstresses cooperative that produced clothes for the entire region, offering paid work to dozens of women who previously depended on others' charity. Pedro do Armazém expanded his business, creating a fair trade network that connected Freedom Farm to other urban centers, guaranteeing dignified prices for local products and access to goods necessary for community development. Mané da Roça, recovered from the injuries suffered during the struggle, became responsible for administering the communal lands where families worked collectively on larger projects, such as road construction and irrigation canals. When the first anniversary of the judicial decision approached, Francisco organized a great celebration that brought together hundreds of people from throughout the region. Former slaves who had migrated returned to visit, bringing news of their new lives and thanking for the opportunity of freedom they had received. During the festival, held on the ground where his great-grandfather Sebastião's sealed cabin once stood, now transformed into a memorial, Francisco gave a simple but moving speech. "Friends, a year ago, we discovered that injustice had stolen from us not only lands but dignity and hope. Today we see that truth has the power to transform not only our lives, but an entire community. May this place always be an example that true freedom only exists when it is shared by all." 3 years had passed since the trial that changed the region's history, and Francisco Santos, at 41 years old, had become a respected figure not only locally, but throughout the province. Letters regularly arrived from other regions where similar situations were beginning to be questioned by families inspired by the Freedom Farm example. Chiquinho, now 13 years old, demonstrated lively intelligence and a thirst for knowledge that impressed everyone. Francisco and Maria das Dores made the decision to send him to study in São Paulo, where Dr. Machado had obtained a scholarship at a preparatory school that would allow the boy to later enter a university. "Father," said Chiquinho on the eve of his departure, "I'm going to study law to help other families like ours." Francisco embraced his son with emotion, seeing in that young man the realization of dreams he himself had never dared to have. "Son, you will take our story to places where I can never reach. But always remember, knowledge only has value when used to serve justice." Education at Freedom Farm continued to expand. Maria das Dores, now assisted by 2 other teachers from the capital, had transformed the school into a regional reference. Children of rich farmers began attending classes, creating an unprecedented social mixture that was forming a new generation with different values from their parents. Colonel Domingos Pereira had transformed into a surprising figure. After his public confession and the reparations made, he dedicated himself entirely to missionary activities, traveling throughout the region to preach about social justice and sincere repentance. Many viewed him with initial skepticism, but his persistence and genuine humility gradually won the respect of the communities he visited. Isabel Pereira, the colonel's only daughter, surprised everyone by announcing her engagement to a young abolitionist teacher from Rio de Janeiro. The wedding, held at Freedom Farm's church, symbolized a union not only between 2 people, but between 2 worldviews that were learning to coexist. As a wedding gift for his daughter, and a final demonstration of his commitment to change, the colonel donated another 400 alcares of land for cooperative expansion, allowing dozens of new families to establish themselves as owners of small plots. Dr. Machado established a permanent office in the region, specializing in land reform cases and minority rights. His experience with the Santos case made him a national reference in social justice issues, and he used this reputation to amplify voices that previously weren't heard. Freedom Farm began receiving visitors from other provinces and even from abroad. Journalists, politicians, and social reformers came to study the Brazilian experiment that was demonstrating the viability of a more just and productive society. A particularly significant event was the visit of a delegation of American abolitionists who were studying post-emancipation integration models. They were impressed by the racial harmony and economic prosperity that had developed in just 3 years. "You have created here something we considered impossible," declared one of the visitors during a dinner offered by Francisco, "a society where skin color doesn't determine a person's destiny." Francisco responded with the humility that had become his trademark. "Sir, we didn't create anything extraordinary. We simply allowed each person to show their true value when free from oppression." The regional economy had completely transformed. The cooperative model had increased productivity by 40% compared to the previous slave system. The workers, motivated by participating in profits, constantly innovated in cultivation and processing methods. The railway that crossed the region was expanded with its own station for Freedom Farm, facilitating production flow and the arrival of new residents. What had begun as an isolated property was becoming a regional development center. When news came that the Golden Law had been signed on May 13, 1888, the celebration at Freedom Farm had a special flavor. They had anticipated national liberation by 8 years, demonstrating that change was not only possible, but beneficial for everyone involved. Old Chico, now 84 years old and quite frail, was carried in a chair to the festival site. "Francisco," he said with a trembling but emotional voice, "I live to see the day your great-grandfather dreamed of. I can die in peace." Actually, old Chico lived 2 more years, enough time to see Chiquinho return from São Paulo as a law graduate and establish the region's first free legal aid office, dedicated specifically to defending the rights of workers and small property owners. At the end of 1889, when the Republic was proclaimed in Brazil, Freedom Farm faced its greatest test. Political changes in the country created uncertainties about the validity of property titles and judicial decisions made during the imperial period. Enemies of the cooperative experiment saw an opportunity to question the legitimacy of the reforms implemented by Francisco. A group of conservative farmers from the region, led by distant relatives of Colonel Domingos, who never accepted his conversion, hired lawyers from São Paulo to contest the 1880 judicial decision. They claimed that the regime change automatically invalidated decisions made under the monarchy. The news reached Francisco through Dr. Machado, who traveled personally to inform him about the new threat. "Francisco, technically they're wrong, but the period of political transition has created a situation of legal uncertainty. We need to be prepared to defend our rights again." This time, however, Francisco wasn't alone as he had been 9 years earlier. Freedom Farm had become a national symbol of the possibility of peaceful social transformation. Abolitionists, progressive Republicans, intellectuals, and even some parliamentarians publicly manifested their support. Chiquinho, now 20 years old and graduated in law, returned from São Paulo to lead the legal defense alongside Dr. Machado. "Father, this is my first battle as a lawyer. There's no cause I'd rather fight for." The challengers' strategy was more sophisticated this time. Instead of frontally attacking the legitimacy of the ancestral documents, they focused on the irregularities of the cooperative process. They claimed that the property was being administered in a way contrary to free market principles and that this harmed regional economic development. They also hired journalists for a discrediting campaign, portraying Freedom Farm as a dangerous socialist experiment that threatened private property throughout the country. Some conservative periodicals reproduced these narratives, creating a public debate about the model implemented by Francisco. The response came from where it was least expected. Former slaves freed by the 1880 decision who had migrated to other regions began voluntarily returning to defend the property. They arrived from São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Minas Novas, and even from abroad, forming a kind of civilian army of witnesses. "This land gave us dignity when everyone denied us humanity," declared Benedito, a 50-year-old man who had become owner of a small hardware workshop in the São Paulo capital. "We came to show the world that freedom works." The trial was scheduled for January 1890 in the new Republican capital. Francisco traveled to São Paulo, accompanied by a committee of 50 people, including workers, former slaves, small property owners, and sympathizers of the cause. The courthouse was packed not only with local interested parties, but with national and international journalists who had transformed the case into a symbol of the possibilities opened by the new Republican order. The challenging lawyers presented complex technical arguments about land legislation and economic principles. They claimed that cooperative models were incompatible with capitalist progress and that Freedom Farm represented a regression to primitive communitarianism. Chiquinho and Dr. Machado counterattacked with impressive data on productivity, education, public health, and social development. They showed that the region had become the most prosperous and egalitarian in the province, with literacy rates close to zero and dramatically reduced infant mortality. "Your Honors," declared Chiquinho in his first intervention as a lawyer, "my father didn't create a socialist experiment. He simply applied Christian principles of justice and fraternity to the administration of a rural property. If this threatens someone, it's because that someone benefits from injustice." The decisive moment came when Francisco was called to testify personally. Now 43 years old, hair beginning to gray, he climbed to the stand with the serene dignity of someone who had faced all possible storms. "Gentlemen," he said with a clear and firm voice, 10 years ago, I discovered that my family had been robbed not only of lands but of hope. Today, hundreds of families live dignifiedly on a property that produces more, educates better, and treats everyone as children of the same God. If this is a crime, I am guilty and proud to be so." The judicial decision was unanimous. The Santos family rights were valid under any political regime, and the cooperative model was not only legal, but should be studied as an example of sustainable social development. When Francisco left the courthouse, he was received by a crowd that shouted his name and applauded his victory. But he knew that the true victory wasn't in the judicial decision, but in the hundreds of transformed lives that now depended on him to keep alive the dream of a more just society. 15 years had passed since that golden afternoon of 1879, when Dr. Benedito Almeida brought news of a mysterious inheritance. Francisco Santos, now 53 years old, walked through the property that had become much more than he had dreamed. It was a model of society that inspired communities throughout Brazil and beyond. Freedom Farm now housed more than 400 free families, each owner of their plot of land, participant in collective profits and builder of a future that seemed impossible when everything began. The school had transformed into an academy that received students from various provinces, and the popular hospital served people from the entire region. Chiquinho, at 24 years old, had become the first black lawyer elected to the provincial assembly, taking to politics the lessons learned in his ancestors' land. He had married Isabel, a young teacher daughter of former slaves, and they were expecting their first child, who would be the fourth generation of Santos to live on those lands. Maria das Dores, at 48 years old, directed a network of rural schools that had spread across 3 provinces, teaching not only letters and numbers, but values of dignity and equality that had transformed an entire region. Her hands, which once sewed clothes to earn a few coins, now wrote primers that educated thousands of children. Dr. Machado had become Justice Minister of the new Republican government, using his position to promote reforms that would expand workers' and minorities' rights. He regularly visited Freedom Farm, always saying that there he found the necessary inspiration to face the political challenges of the capital. Colonel Domingos Pereira had died 2 years earlier, at 78 years old, after dedicating his last years to missionary activities. In his will, he left all remaining assets for the expansion of the popular hospital and requested to be buried in Freedom Farm's simple cemetery, alongside those I wronged and who forgave me. That May afternoon of 1894, Francisco was alone in the small cabin that his great-grandfather Sebastião had sealed 89 years before. The place had been transformed into the Memorial of Freedom, where visitors from around the world came to learn the story of how a family recovered not only their lands, but their dignity. The walls displayed the original documents that changed his life, alongside photographs showing the property's evolution over the years. Letters from famous abolitionists, international newspaper articles, and testimonies from former slaves created a mosaic of social transformation that had radiated from that point to distant regions. Francisco took the letter left by his great-grandfather, now protected in glass but still legible after almost a century. The lands from Gold Creek to the top of the mountain belong to our family since 1790. May God protect whoever fights for the truth. Sebastião Santos couldn't have imagined that his simple words would inspire a movement that would transform not only his descendants' lives, but the social reality of an entire era. The truth for which he had fought in vain had finally triumphed, but in a more grandiose way than he had ever dreamed. Francisco looked out the cabin window, seeing black, white, and mixed-race children playing together in the schoolyard, their laughter echoing like music through fields where before only the lament of the oppressed could be heard. He saw men and women who had been born slaves working their own lands, educating their children, building the future with their own hands. A tear of gratitude rolled down his face when he realized that his great-grandfather's silent prophecy had been fulfilled. A Santos had returned to claim justice. But what he had recovered was infinitely greater than lands or properties. It was proof that human dignity cannot be destroyed, only temporarily put to sleep. At dusk, when the sun painted golden the mountains that embraced that blessed valley, Francisco gathered with his extended family in the main house yard. Hundreds of people joined the weekly celebration that had become tradition, a moment of gratitude and reflection on the path traveled. "Friends," said Francisco, his voice carrying the serenity of someone who had found his purpose in life, 15 years ago we discovered that our family had been robbed not only of lands but of hope. Today we see that the greatest inheritance we received wasn't the 800 alqueires left by great-grandfather Sebastião, but the lesson that true freedom only exists when it is shared by all. Warm applause echoed through the valley while the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Francisco looked up, imagining that his great-grandfather, his father, and all the ancestors who had dreamed of that day were finally at peace. The cabin, sealed for 74 years, had kept more than documents and objects. It had preserved the seed of a transformation that would continue growing for generations, spreading throughout the country as a living example that justice, however delayed, always finds its way to the light. That night, while families returned to their own homes, Francisco walked one last time down the trail that led to the creek. The murmur of waters that had accompanied his childhood was still there, but now it sang a different song. The song of freedom, conquered with courage, maintained with wisdom, and shared with love. The Santos story had become the story of the Brazil that could be, a country where origin doesn't determine destiny, where justice is worth more than power, where truth is stronger than oppression. And so, under the starry sky of Minas Gerais, Francisco Santos fell asleep, knowing he had honored his ancestors' trust and left for his descendants an inheritance infinitely greater than any property, the certainty that free men can build a just society when they have the courage to dream and the determination to fight.